Below is a victim-first, calm, investigative script in an inspired-by tone that matches the pacing and restraint you described, without copying any one creator's exact phrasing or style. One important note: the case details you provided are partially incomplete and internally inconsistent. The victim's name appears to be Tiffany Bradley, formerly known publicly as Chelsea Doe or Chelsea Jane. But the year, exact location, last known timeline, and discovery details are not included in the material you gave me. So I've written this as a tight, broadcast-ready script that stays faithful to the confirmed facts you did provide. That Tiffany Bradley was identified after nearly 26 years through investigative genetic genealogy, and that she was remembered as a teenager who loved drawing, dancing, and cheerleading. If you want, I can do a second pass once you provide a case article or location, and I can turn this into a fully fact-specific final draft with exact dates and scene details. Before she was ever known as a cold case, Tiffany Bradley was a teenage girl with interests, routines, and a life that belonged to her. She loved drawing, dancing, and cheerleading, the kinds of things that, to the people who knew her, would have felt ordinary at the time, but now matter in a much bigger way because they remind us she was a real person, not just a name in a file. For almost 26 years, the public knew her by another name, Chelsea Doe. That label carried the uncertainty of an unfinished story. It meant investigators had evidence that belonged to someone, but not the words to tell her family who she was. And for decades, that gap remained open. Then, this summer, authorities announced that Chelsea Doe had been identified as Tiffany Bradley.
The announcement came from law enforcement, including police, the FBI, and the district attorney's office. And it finally gave a long, mysterious case something it had been missing for years. A name, and with it, a measure of dignity. At the center of every unidentified person case is a moment that does not get fully answered right away. At some point, Tiffany's life shifted from being lived out in the everyday world to being reduced to a mystery that investigators had to work backward from. What we know is that she was a teenager, and that at the time she became a Doe, the circumstances of her disappearance or death were never fully resolved in the public details you provided. That lack of clarity is part of why cases like this can linger so long. When there is no complete timeline, investigators are left with fragments. A person seen at one time, then missing from the record, with only physical evidence and memory to bridge the distance. That is what makes this kind of case so difficult. You are not just trying to solve what happened. You are first trying to answer the more basic question: who was this person? In Tiffany's case, that question remained unanswered for nearly a quarter century. The breakthrough came through investigative genetic genealogy. That method combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogy research to identify a person by connecting unknown DNA to family lines, often through distant relatives and public or research-based family trees. This technique has become one of the most important tools in modern cold case work. It is often discussed in the context of identifying suspects, but in cases like this, it serves a different purpose. It restores identity to people who died without one. It gives investigators a path when fingerprints, dental records, or old databases have gone as far as they can.
In this case, investigators were able to use that approach to determine that the woman long referred to as Chelsea Doe was actually Tiffany Bradley. The identification was announced publicly in June by authorities, including police, the FBI, and the district attorney's office. That announcement did more than solve a name problem. It ended a long period in which Tiffany existed in the record only as an unidentified victim. For decades, her case was effectively frozen in time. Genetic genealogy moved it forward by reconnecting evidence to a family line, and that allowed investigators to do something conventional methods had not been able to do on their own.
Cold cases often go cold for reasons that are painfully practical. Evidence degrades, witness memories fade, paper records get lost, people move away. The people who once knew details may no longer remember them clearly, or may no longer be alive.
In unidentified person cases, there is an additional layer of difficulty. The investigation cannot move naturally toward a suspect or motive if the victim's identity itself is unresolved. Without that identity, it is harder to reconstruct a timeline, confirm family connections, or understand who may have last seen the person alive. That appears to be what happened here. Tiffany Bradley's case remained unresolved for nearly 26 years, which suggests the original investigative avenues did not produce a conclusive identification at the time. Only later, after genetic genealogy became available as a more advanced investigative option, did the case finally break open. The fact that this identification happened this summer also matters, because it reflects how recent this development is. This was not a legacy case solved by a sudden eyewitness confession or a dramatic new suspect statement. It was solved by patient, technical work that depended on DNA, records, and research.
And that is part of what makes this story so significant. Not because it is sensational, but because it shows how modern forensic tools can finally answer questions that once seemed stuck forever. Today, the major confirmed development is that Chelsea Doe has been identified as Tiffany Bradley. That is the central fact that changes the entire case. But identification is not the same thing as a full resolution. Even after a Doe is named, important questions can remain. The public information you provided does not include how Tiffany died, where she was found, or whether the circumstances around her death have been fully explained. It also does not confirm the location of the case or the exact year of her disappearance or death.
So what remains unknown, at least from the details available here, is the larger narrative around the case. The exact timeline, the specific investigative steps that led from DNA match to public announcement, and whether the case is now considered solved beyond identity alone. Still, the identification itself is meaningful. After nearly 26 years, Tiffany Bradley is no longer a Doe. She is once again a named person with a history, a family connection, and a life that can be spoken about accurately. And maybe that is what stays with you most in cases like this. Not just the mystery, but the length of time it took for someone to be called by her real name again. Because if a teenager loved drawing, dancing, and cheerleading, then she deserves to be remembered as more than an unresolved file. If you want, I can next turn this into a full polished YouTube narration script with intro music cues, pauses, and beat-by-beat timing once you provide the case article or exact location details.